we're now going to pause the debate of motions because it now gives me the great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for this session, our General Secretary, Christina McAnea. Christina, welcome.
I don't know why that felt like a really long walk for some reason. Good morning, everyone. Christina McAnea, General Secretary, and my pronouns are she, her. So it's really great to be here with you. I know it's been an especially difficult year for local government. Services suffering from a disastrous funding crisis, facing a funding gap of £6.2 billion over the next 2 years, an increasing number of councils that have issued Section 114 notices and in effect declared themselves bankrupt, 1 in 5 council leaders saying that they think they'll be bankrupt in 15 months. And now the Tory government will tell you this is down to local mismanagement. They love to highlight it when it's Labour councils. But this is happening across the board. It's happening in Tory councils too. Because the reality is, as we all know, the fault lies with 14 years of Tory mismanagement, 14 years of a Tory government that has systematically and deliberately underfunded local councils. Only yesterday, you may have already heard this, UNISON released new research showing that huge cuts to the youth service risk creating a lost generation of young people unable to access vital services at a critical time in their lives. Funding cuts that have led to the closure of almost 40% of council-run youth centres in England and Wales since 2010. The loss of so many facilities, the loss of so much expert staff has put teenagers at serious risk. And tomorrow, more research will be published that shows that almost 40% of council-run children's centres have been closed across England, with the situation only going to get worse as town halls struggle to avoid bankruptcy. And of course, this has hit deprived areas and disadvantaged families the hardest. We know that the Tory austerity plan, and it was a plan conference, a deliberate plan, has meant incredible hardship and a legacy from which some communities will never recover. This government has targeted lower income Labour areas for the biggest cuts. So it's no surprise that places like Birmingham and Nottingham have been hit the hardest. But it's also happening in places like Shropshire. I was there earlier this year, run by the Tories, although having spoken to our branch secretary, our great branch secretary there, I understand that some Tory mismanagement may actually have been at fault there. But I want to congratulate our branches in those councils, and indeed in councils across the country, for defending public services and for defending our members. Because our members are committed to the services they provide, supporting the most vulnerable, educating our children, keeping our local communities safe and healthy. It's the Tory government that has put all of this at risk, and it's time for a change. If Labour wins the general election, one of their first big crises will be how to deal with local government funding. Now, I know they can't reverse all of that overnight, but we do need to see real investment in public services and in particular in local government. And a fairer funding system, moving on from the way the Tories have favoured areas where they're strong at the expense of Labour-controlled areas. They've been absolutely blatant about it. Local government needs more certainty with longer-term funding settlements so councils can plan for the future. And that's what our service group executive, your service group executive, has been fighting for. And I want to take this time to thank the local government service group executive, all of the committee members, and in particular to Glenn and Lorraine as the leaders of that committee. I want to thank them for the hard work that they put in. I also want to thank all of the staff who give support to that committee and to our branches under the leadership of Mike and Ruth, and of course all of our regional staff who support you in branches, for all the hard work that goes into producing the guidance, the campaigns, the advice and support that we produce for branches. And Conference, I know that that support is really needed, because if you listen to the Tories, the problems in local government are down to local failings. And we still get the likes of organisations like the Taxpayers Alliance, who like to talk about non-jobs in local government. They produce a list of these every year. And they talk about the woke policies of local authorities. Apparently, the crisis in local government isn't down to the fact that money's been drained out of the system by the fraudsters who sold us fake PPE, or the corrupt politicians who've made money by awarding contracts to their mates or to companies that they have a personal interest in. That's not who's to blame. It's you lot that's to blame. It's the librarians who have the cheek to keep buying more books for the libraries, or who fight to keep libraries open in rural areas so that groups of older people or parent and baby groups can actually have somewhere to meet. Or it's the cheek of these schools who insist in loaning musical instruments to working class children. That's what's causing the financial crisis in this country, not the Tories and all of their corrupt mates. But we know that it's local government that is the glue that holds our communities together. It's a phrase we say all the time. It's a bit of a cliche, but sometimes cliches are true, and this is definitely true in this case. And I was just trying to think of some of the more slightly unusual jobs that some of our members do in local government. So as well as the public-facing, high-profile jobs that we hear about, and you'll know this, but I just found some interesting ones. We have members whose job is to actually work with local communities to grow fruit and vegetables in allotments. We have trading standards officers who stop rogue traders selling dangerous toys, or who close down restaurants that have appalling hygiene standards and make people sick. We have members who look after artefacts, priceless artefacts and antiques and things that remind us of the past in our local museums. My daughter is one of them, I have to say, in Glasgow, and a member. But we also have members who do things like clear out houses that had been used as drug dens so that local families can be safely moved into them. Jobs that don't always hit the headlines, but jobs that are incredibly important in local communities. And Conference, we know the cost of living crisis is still very real. We've seen the biggest fall in living standards in 70 years. And we know local government pay awards aren't good enough. Last year, we went straight to a ballot over pay in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And I know the amount of work that has to go into getting a yes vote. And we poured loads of resources into it. I know that you as branches gave your all to get yes votes. In Northern Ireland, our members were balloted on their pay and grading campaign and took successful strike action, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But in England and Wales, we had very few large employers where we hit the 50% threshold, and we need to learn the lessons from this. Overall, we saw an increase in the turnout, the national turnout across the union, but it wasn't enough to take action. This year, we're currently consulting members on the employer's offer as we speak, as you're here this week. And if we get a reject vote, we'll need to look at the turnout and think carefully about the best way to go forward, because we don't want a repeat of last year. So how can we make sure that if we take action, it's effective and it makes a difference? In Scotland, we've seen how a targeted approach can work. Members in schools and waste departments across Scotland took strike action last year, and they got an improved offer, making real gains. And of course, we've had a great success in a number of local campaigns, and I want to congratulate them and all of our branches for pursuing these disputes. But winning ballots takes time and resources, and it also means listening to members, engaging with members on issues that matter to them. And I want to go back to Northern Ireland, because just this week, just last week, after a series of really intense negotiations and after continuous industrial action since last November, they have just won a huge victory on pay and grading for everyone in schools in Northern Ireland. And Conference, this could be a really important year for our members in schools. Labour has committed to bringing back the School Support Staff Negotiating Body in England and we hope also in Wales. Now, we worked hard to achieve this, only to see it cancelled by the Tories back in 2010. I say that because I was the National Secretary for Education at the time, and I felt I lived, breathed, ate and slept the School Support Staff Negotiating Body, or as we called it, the Triple SNB. Looking at my colleague Ben here, who also worked on it, and several others. And I know there's probably people in this room who were involved in that campaign at that time. I know that Pam Howard, who's the chair of our School Sector Committee, she was very closely involved in it. But this time it's a chance to get it right, because the world has moved on since 2010. The world of schools has moved on since 2010. But it's a chance to do something for such a large group within our union. You don't need me to tell you that 40% of our members in local government work in schools. They make up 1 in 5 of our entire membership in the union. This is a really big group for us. And the reality is that these schools are increasingly run not by local authorities in England, but by multi-academy trusts. And we've seen some fantastic organising campaigns in schools this year. In April, I was at the schools seminar, and we heard from activists from the Bridge Academy Trust. The trust were ripping off school support staff by delaying implementing the NJC pay award by 5 months. And that was a trigger for a really brilliant campaign. We saw huge recruitment of non-members, and we really increased the density, and threatening action was enough to force those employers back into negotiations and to win the pay award for those members. And of course, while the governance of schools might vary across the United Kingdom, some campaigns affect everyone in that sector, such as ensuring that school buildings are safe and fit for purpose, and fighting for recognition of the growing threats and actual violence against school staff. I attended several AGMs in local government branches earlier this year, and violence in schools came up at every single one of them. I mean, hugely in every single one of them. And some of them, the debate went on for quite some time about violence in schools. And I visited a large special needs school in Newark last year on Stars in Our Schools Day. And again, when I was talking to our members, violence in schools was a big issue for people who worked there. And just because violence is a risk, just because some children don't mean to be violent, that shouldn't mean it becomes an acceptable part of the job. But that seems to be what's happening in too many schools. Everything can be risk assessed, and steps can be taken to remove the risk, or at least minimise it as far as possible, and put things in place to support staff who are the ones who have to deal with that risk. And we are not seeing enough of that in schools. So, Conference, we do take this seriously, and we will be supporting our members in schools all the way through this campaign, and I hope we win this. And similarly, in further education, we see so clearly how little the Tories care about it. I hope there's some FE people in the room. Somewhere? Further education? So, I mean, when was the last time you ever heard a government minister even mention the words further education? It's just not part of their vocabulary. And why? Because most Tories have never used further education, or their children and families don't use further education. But we know its importance, because we know from work and surveys that we've done that most of our members and their families get their post-school education through further education colleges. That's how important it is for people like us, people like our members. So, Conference, further education will always be something that UNISON speaks up for. Now, Some of you might have noticed that there's something going on in the country at the moment. It's the general election. Might have bypassed some of you. It does feel to me like it's been going on for months rather than just 3 weeks. I mean, I don't know how you feel about it. And I seriously worry that Ed Davey won't survive all that trampolining and canoeing and whitewater rafting or whatever it is he's doing. Every time I see him, I get panicky and nervous when I watch him on TV. And just last week, I was doing some TV and a journalist in the break actually said to me, "Don't you sometimes feel sorry for Rishi Sunak?" And I looked at her and I said, the man's richer than the king. Why on earth would I feel sorry for him? So it's just strange the way some people view what's going on. And, you know, when you listen to the Tories, who do they blame for what's happening in this country? They blame migrants. They blame the strikers. They blame benefits claimants. They blame people who really don't have that much power in this country, but apparently they're to blame for the chaos that they've caused for the past 14 years. Now, you may not support everything in the Labour manifesto. I personally might wish that they'd gone a bit further in terms of taxing wealth or commitments to funding our public services. But, Conference, I make no apology for saying my big hope is that I wake up on the 5th of July to a Labour government. And I really hope everyone in this room feels that way. Because I want to wake up to a government we can actually work with, not one that shuts us out of discussions, not one that sees us as the enemy, but one that actually sees us as something that helps to drive the economy of our country, because that's what public services do. They're not a drain on the economy. We drive the economy of this country. And I want a government, and if Labour get elected, that will deal with us on that basis. And if Labour gets elected, they will have to deal with the mess that is local government. They will have to deal with the fact that our essential services are crumbling before our eyes. And I make that case about public services and in particular about local government every single time I speak to the Labour Party. And I give you my word on this. I will not give up on pushing this when Labour come into government to say they absolutely must deal with the crisis in local government. But Conference, make no mistake, we absolutely have to get the Tories out. Our members cannot afford 5 more years of plummeting living standards. Our public services cannot sustain 5 more years of cuts. And our communities cannot afford 5 more years of decline and division. I'm looking forward to coming back this afternoon to honour the winners of the Local Government Service Champions Award. But the truth is, of course, that every one of our members is a champion. Every one of our members in councils and schools and colleges doing great work every single day. And I look forward to working with a government who values them as much as we do. Thank you.